Do you think this Davis report, or Howard Davis, is ushering in a different kind of era where he's kind of saying, yeah, you can have your growth, but there are some pretty big conditions on it, and you have to meet those conditions, otherwise no growth? Virginia, what do you think? Do you think it feels different, like a different approach?
I think it is a different approach, and as Stephen was saying, it hopefully gets over that it's not in the Act, because the aim will be that this wider benefit will be in a DCO or a hybrid bill that goes forward to do it. As always, it will be in how this is delivered and how this goes through and how many of those things fall away in order to get to project delivery and budgets and etc. But I think it's a positive approach, and it is a different approach, so I think helpful.
What level of confidence do you have that Heathrow will go along with virtually all of these conditions?
I think they'll find it difficult to remove the majority of those, as it's such a strong statement. But and I suspect that they will want to be positive about it as well, because that's how they'll get their runway delivered, which is what they want to do. But again, there's always a balance when you move these projects through, from the aspiration to the delivery, and how that, as previous speakers have talked about, how that is delivered, whether it's through a wider body, whether it's through the delivery body of the runway itself, whether it's through Heathrow, whether it's through local authorities, central government. That will become that will be the difficult sort of factor in that, to make sure that they are delivered all the way through.
Danny, do you think this is the way it's got to go now? You can have it, but you've really got to look after the people around you, the neighbours, as he called them.
If it was solely up to me, yes, but it isn't. The Howard Davis's report is a recommendation to government. The government can pick and choose what to do with the recommended conditions. Heathrow can lobby on around them. I would suspect they will take a very careful view of the conditions, and they will, I would imagine, they would price the effects of compliance and weigh up what's the risk of trying to push too hard against some of the conditions in terms of achieving the overall objective of getting what they want out of it, which is the third runway. Having said that, quite a lot of what is in the report as conditions, Heathrow are already offering. The very substantially improved noise insulation scheme, they've already said they're going to do that. Howard Davis has kind of co-opted that. They're already quite keen on doing that. And there are other things that are kind of outside of the Heathrow's sort of control. The independent noise ombudsman. I mean, that is a decision for government. Does the government want to create another, quango, for want of a better word? But personally, I think it'd be a good idea. But looking at what happened, for example, with the planning system and the slimming down of the whole control of the planning system, that may not sit with some of the current government's thinking around the size and scope of government.
Stephen, it sounds like you've answered a lot of angry emails in your time, as have I, about coverage. Yeah, but how bad will it go down? How badly will it go down, in your experience, if Heathrow start pushing against some of this stuff? How much will that annoy people?
Well, as a visitor, as it were, to this industry, it would go down very badly. I can recall, and I think it is relevant, the previous Crossrail project failed in May 1994 in committee in the House. And look, 25 years went by. And that failed because the promoters failed to settle with one East London borough. And that borough produced one afternoon far better evidence than Crossrail could muster. And 400 people lost their jobs, and 20 years worth of the potential of Crossrail just pushed back the 20 years. So my experience is ignore what's in print at your peril. And if other people think it's a good idea, pay attention.
I mean, it's probably a bit of a guess, this, but how far out does this spread, do you think? Because when Boris talks about Heathrow affecting people, and noise-wise, for example, he talks about everybody living in London. 1 million people were on Zach's map. So we're often talking about people in local councils. Does this go a lot wider, do you think?
Yes, in many respects. I am a little bit sceptical the impacts are as great as is stated by some, but they certainly further than the airport tends to portray them. Not least of which there is some rather nerdy technical reasons as to why when they produce, for example, the noise contours, the noise envelopes, they're average conditions. They don't actually, they're hypothetical, they don't actually reflect the reality of how the airport operates. So just on a straightforward basis, on a day-to-day basis, there are numbers of people to the east or the west, depending on whether it's an easterly or westerly operations, who are outside of the average contour, but within what's called the single mode, and are exposed to noise levels that are generally regarded as not being particularly, good. I am a little sceptical that people sort of at the extremes of East London are seriously affected by noise from Heathrow. No doubt they hear the aircraft, but there is a big difference between hearing and there being a significant effect.
Can you clear up this average thing? Because I had Teddington people coming up to me the other day basically saying, all right, we don't get aircraft 2 days out of 3, but on the one day we get them, that's when it peaks, except what they do is they average it out across the 3 days. Is that accurate? Layman's terms, explaining someone how they do it?
Not strictly across the 3, well, I suppose it does. I mean, the conventional way that this has been approached is most airports in the UK are aligned east and west. I know there are a lot of exceptions, but most of them are. And that's to cope with the general prevailing wind directions. Aircraft tend to want to approach and depart into the wind. And that generally leads to the majority of the time aircraft approaching and departing certainly from Heathrow in a westerly direction. But there are, for a substantial minority of the time, approaches and departures in the opposite direction. So that leads to differences. The way that the aircraft approach and depart from the aircraft from the airports are very different, and the noise distribution is very different. So it is quite variable. But the averaging issue is quite subtle. The government do recognise this in the policy regarding aviation noise. They do actually say that people don't actually experience noise in an averaged way, and they do say that you should be looking to use other ways of assessing it, which is why I'm very pleased with what the Airport Commission has done by using a suite of metrics. They use at its core an average process, but then they look at other ways of assessing the noise that try to take into account this variability and this difference between the way that people experience noise and the average flat line.
My name's Jeremy Pine from Uttlesford Council. My question is to Danny, if you need a suite of noise metrics to accurately represent noise, how would that work with a noise envelope?
Well, the typical way it works is you can have a noise envelope. Typically you use an energy average metric to set your noise envelope perimeter, so to speak, the size of it, and then you back that up with the flight cap. So you actually so that there is an ability within that flight cap to have a degree of horse trading of slightly quieter aircraft with more aircraft movements, but you're not. You're not in a position whereby there can be a radical increase in aircraft for a very small reduction in the individual noisiness of the aircraft. It's not easy, but it needs to be very carefully calibrated. There is a danger with solely relying upon a noise envelope that you don't actually. There can be unintended consequences.
Virginia, you said you were confused by the HS2 packages. I've been there. I've looked at them as well, so I'm with you on that one. But what you get from HS2, I've been taken around Camden and shown the houses where basically the people will get nothing, even though they're going to be right next to the building site, literally hoardings a few feet from their windows because they live in a city. So is there a date, and the people who live in the countryside get a better deal, even though it's because it's quieter. In theory, there's a background noise. Is there a danger that you get these sort of tailored compensation packages and you end up people end up losing out?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think that's where there's a real focus towards that rural support zone, as it's known in HS2, and the impact of for places like Camden has been minimised and not dealt with so strongly. And I think when you're putting together the enhanced packages, this is why having a very consistent and very structured approach to it, which fits in with both the impact on people and the project, is important, because I suspect that there's no intention that the people in Camden lose out. It was simply that the people in the rural support zone fought harder at one point and therefore got a sort of a better deal under this. So I think that the importance of that structure and the framework of the statutory situation is really important to make sure you don't end up with that.
The other thing that comes across to me when I talk to people is if you go for the deal early because you want to move, maybe your job moves, go near family, you get married, whatever it is, you can often end up with a worse deal than the people who hang on a bit and say as the sort of the compensation deal progresses. How big an issue is that, do you think? Or should you retrospectively give them what the end deal is, not what the deal was 6 months in?
Yeah, I mean, I think that some of the deals that HS2 have offered are that if they buy now, unless you meet very strict criteria, you simply get the market value of your property. And that's actually a very common situation ahead of the authority having compulsory purchase powers. The question about when that swaps over to people having the same compensation as if they've been compulsory purchased is always a very grey area. And my view is that as soon as it becomes obvious that the authority is going to compulsorily purchase your property unless you agree, that there's a very good case for saying, right, we swap over into the situation where you're entitled to the same compensation, market value, severance, injurious affection, all those statutory entitlements should be at that point. In the current guidance from government, it's pretty clear that that's the case, and in the proposed new guidance, it's still the case in that. I think where you sometimes get the differential is both HS2 is offering to buy properties that are not strictly required in terms of we're going to acquire and demolish for this, and those are some of the properties which are simply getting market value and none of the other elements. So it is tying it back to what statutory entitlements are and when that flips over into that rather than just an offer to purchase is the way that you can, I think, provide the fairness and transparency to it.
Stephen, you talked about worst practices. And as a journalist, my ears prick up. What are the things you just should never do? You don't have to name names, but what are the things that people have got very wrong?
Talk to councillors, elected members, ignoring the officers. Don't do it. Very bad move. Never get the relationship back. It's the officers that advise the members, etc. Heavy-handed approach of being remote is also a no-no, and of telling people how much they will enjoy this benefit. The Whitechapel, not necessarily Whitechapel example with Crossrail, but this will be a wonderful railway scheme, put up with the noise now being the implication. It's so easy for people genuinely to say, well, I don't want to go to wherever it is you're offering me with a new service. It antagonises people, it's heard at meetings. Another no-no is to go into badly constructed public meetings. There's many other ways of having panels, community involvement, etc. But I'm always surprised, never cease to be surprised how people will advertise a public meeting and expect it to have a good managed outcome. The structures I've seen, the reverse of that, do work, are where the local authority leads and takes the minutes, and the project promoter attends as the technical expert and speaks at the invitation of the chair. Then you get published results. So just don't go charging in there thinking a public meeting in a church hall full of many others is actually the way to do it.
You talked about community liaison person and don't let it be an afterthought. I mean, what kind of person are you looking for to go and do that?
Somebody that's got some sympathy, someone that can remember that line from the New Testament about treat others as you'd like to be treated, Luke chapter 6, verse 31. I have quoted it occasionally at a certain project. Well, if you visualise how that other person feels about what you're doing to them and have some empathy, I think that should be a very good starting point if you have no other antennae to help you towards how to treat them.
How important is it to have one place where everyone can go for answers? Again, what's come across a lot from HS2 for me is that no one knows who to ring. If there are lorries going down the road, construction lorries, and you'd agreed that they weren't meant to go down that road, who do you ring? How important is it to have a number, a phone number, a person, as the project is going on, that people can go to?
Well, it's essential. Crossrail has one 24-hour helpline. I can phone it if I see one of their trucks which are badged up where it shouldn't be in Victoria Street, for example. It's recorded with me doing it. You must have one place, and you must have 24-hour staffing. More people at night than during the day, because that's when the airborne noise issue comes to the fore. You can't do anything other than that. If it can be backed up with a street presence or a high street shop presence related to the project, so much the better. But you really can't have dispersed. And I've looked at the HS2 website and had some conversations with them as well about things like that. got to centralise it and manage it and publish the results of people phoning you.
Yeah, Danny, talking about websites, I mean, how important is it to have all the information easily accessible on a website, for example? What do you think is the best way people can... How do I know if I'm standing there, if an aircraft is going slightly in the wrong direction and it's more noisy than it's meant to be? If the aircraft is cutting a corner, how do I prove that?
There are some very good web-based systems for providing information to residents. You can, in almost real time rather, track the movements of aircraft. So you can see what the aircraft is, you can see where it's going, and this is typically linked to noise information as well. There are a number of proprietary systems, and that can be very helpful. But it needs to be backed up by a clear explanation of how flight paths and the way the aircraft fly to and from an airport works. There is a perception sometimes that there are railway roads in the sky. They're not. They're flight corridors. They're anything up to 3 to 4 kilometres wide. There can be quite considerable movement. And just to tell one story about how this can go wrong, I was aware they introduced a system like this at Vancouver Airport. Vancouver Airport, several years ago, had major changes, and there's a lot of resistance to it, and they put this system in place as part of the community engagement. And it proved very successful, but as you tend to get in many circumstances, you can have motivated residents who almost sit there staring at the screen looking for the slightest deviation. And the chief executive of the airport got a rather angry email from a regular contactor complaining about a particular aircraft being off track and flying over her house. And as soon as she got back from Paris, she wanted to go and see him personally to be explained why this aircraft was flying over her home while she was 9,000 miles away.
Lucky guy, yeah, getting that one. Virginia, what about the people who aren't directly affected but still feel very peed off about the aircraft going over their heads? The people who won't get any money or just get a tiny bit of money. What more can you do for people like that? Because they still feel just as affected as the person, in some ways, losing your home. I'm not for everybody, but might even be easier because you can get more than market value and you can move somewhere else.
Yeah, I mean, I think that to me, the legislation does actually look after people who have land acquired better than the people who have the specified impact, and as you say, the people in then that wider circle. I think some of the ideas about the contact information, let's not call it consultation if it's just information, but information consultation, the single contact that can help. So someone who has the power and the knowledge and to make changes rather than someone that is sympathetic, but nothing happens. And I think some of the ideas about the community fund that has a wider impact from that. I mean, some of the things that were talked about were Manchester Airports fund for cultural and activities, and that being a popular. So I think something that delivers the wider would be useful to those people, and see that actually we're seeing some downsides to here, but there are some upsides, and they are trying at least, I think, is the...
There was one idea mooted just before we finish about naming and shaming airlines that were noisy, or things like that. How do you feel that would go down, Stephen, with people seeing their name up in lights?
Well, the audience would love it. What would it do? It would add to the mix of the image of that airline. I suppose you could drag it down, pull it up. I'd love to read that and look at, and then think, oh dear, I actually like travelling with them, so maybe I'll stop looking at it. It would add to the mix of the imagery, and the airline would have to decide what it was going to do about it and reposition itself genuinely with its technology, I guess, or look at its PR brand and values.
I have done some work with several airlines who are in the process of substantial sort of refleeting, changing their aircraft makeup, and as sustainability and awareness of green issues, what to use an overworked phrase, have become more and more important. They've actually seen it as an advantage to their marketing, to be able to make the point that the aircraft that they are using are the quietest ones that are suitable for this purpose. And it really wouldn't help support that attempt at creating a positive image, to then be said, well, okay, you've got the quietest aircraft, but you're flying it in the noisiest way.
Okay, on that note, thank you very much, all of you, for joining us. Thank you. Thank you.